Barcelona, July 9th, 1938. A telegram arrives at the Soviet NKVD station in the city. It's addressed to Alexander Orlov, the senior Soviet intelligence officer in Spain, the man who has spent the past 2 years running Soviet covert operations in the Spanish Civil War, building agent networks, directing assassinations, managing the transfer of Spanish gold reserves to Moscow, and training Republican security forces in methods learned from the most sophisticated intelligence apparatus in the world. The telegram orders him to report to a Soviet ship anchored in Antwerp, Belgium, for a meeting with a senior official. It's signed with authorizations that look correct, that bear the right codes and the right names. But Orlov reads it with the eyes of a man who has spent his entire adult life in Soviet intelligence, who understands every nuance of how the system communicates, who knows what certain kinds of messages mean beneath their surface language. He's been watching his colleagues disappear for over a year. Senior NKVD officers, men he's worked with for decades, recalled to Moscow one by one and never heard from again. He knows what happens on Soviet ships anchored in foreign ports to men who've received messages like this one. He's been in this business long enough to know that some summons are not invitations. Orlov doesn't go to Antwerp. Instead, he packs what he can carry, takes his wife and daughter, and boards a ship to Canada. From there, he travels to the United States. He walks away from the Soviet intelligence service with 20 years of operational knowledge in his head, knowledge about networks, methods, agents, operations, and secrets that reach into the highest levels of the Stalin regime. He is 42 years old. He is one of the most senior Soviet intelligence officers ever to defect to the West. And what he knows, and what he chooses to do with that knowledge over the next 3 decades, makes his story one of the most extraordinary in the history of Cold War espionage. But to understand what Orlov was running from, and what he carried with him, we need to go back to the beginning, back to where he came from, and what he built his career doing. Alexander Orlov was born Leba Lazarevich Feldman in 1895 in Bobruisk, in what is now Belarus, into a Jewish family of modest means. He studied law before the revolution, became involved in Bolshevik politics, and after the October Revolution joined the new Soviet security apparatus, the Cheka, in 1920. His early career involved counterintelligence work, border security operations, and the kind of foundational intelligence work that the new Soviet state required as it consolidated power against internal and external enemies. He was talented, demonstrably so, and the talent was of a specific kind that the intelligence apparatus valued. He was methodical, intellectually rigorous, capable of managing complex operations across multiple countries and multiple agent networks simultaneously. He had the quality that distinguished good intelligence officers from merely competent ones, the ability to hold the entire architecture of an operation in his mind while managing its individual components. He could see the whole picture while never losing track of the details. By the late 1920s, under the operational pseudonym Schwed, and later under various other cover identities, Orlov was conducting foreign intelligence operations in Western Europe. He worked in France, in Germany, in Britain, building the networks that Soviet intelligence required as it developed its capabilities in the major capitalist countries. This was the period when Soviet foreign intelligence was expanding rapidly, when the ideological appeal of communism was drawing educated, committed Westerners into the Soviet orbit, creating the agent networks that would eventually produce some of the most significant intelligence coups of the 20th century. Orlov's role in recruiting and running agents in Britain during this period is one of the most historically significant and most debated aspects of his career. The Cambridge Five, the group of British intelligence and government officials who spied for the Soviet Union from the 1930s onward, including Kim Philby, Guy Burgess, Donald Maclean, Anthony Blunt, and John Cairncross, were recruited and initially handled through Soviet intelligence networks operating in Britain during exactly the period when Orlov was active there. The specific question of what role Orlov played in the Cambridge network has been examined by intelligence historians for decades. The evidence suggests he was involved in the broader organizational framework within which these agents operated, though the exact nature of his involvement, whether he personally recruited any of them, whether he served as their direct handler, whether his relationship with the network was supervisory or operational, remains a matter of ongoing historical debate. What is established is that Orlov was a senior figure in Soviet intelligence in Britain during a crucial period in the Cambridge Group's development, and that his knowledge of these agents was one of the most sensitive pieces of intelligence he carried when he defected. In 1936, Orlov received one of the most significant assignments of his career. He was sent to Spain as the senior NKVD officer attached to the Republican government in the Spanish Civil War. The Soviet Union had decided to intervene on the Republican side, providing military equipment, advisors, and intelligence support in the conflict against Franco's nationalist forces, backed by Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. Orlov's mission was to establish and run Soviet intelligence operations in Spain, to advise the Republican security services, and to manage the complex political dimensions of Soviet involvement. Spain in 1936 and 1937 was a laboratory of Soviet intelligence methods, an environment where Orlov operated with extraordinary scope and latitude. He helped establish the SIM, the Republican Military Intelligence Service, providing organizational models drawn from NKVD practice. He supervised the training of Republican security personnel in interrogation techniques and surveillance methods. He ran networks of agents within the Republican zone, monitoring not just nationalist activities, but also the behavior of the various Republican factions, particularly the POUM, the anti-Stalinist Marxist Party whose independent politics made it a target of Soviet attention. The POUM operation is one of the darkest chapters of Orlov's Spanish career. The suppression of the POUM in 1937, including the arrest and murder of its leader, Andres Nin, was carried out by Republican security forces acting under Soviet direction. Nin was arrested, tortured for information about supposed fascist connections, and then killed when he refused to confess to fabricated charges. The operation was designed to eliminate an independent left-wing political force that competed with the Soviet-aligned Communist Party for influence within the Republican movement. Orlov's specific role in the Nin murder has been analyzed by historians. The evidence indicates that while the operation was conducted within the broader framework of Soviet intelligence activity in Spain that Orlov supervised, the direct operational responsibility for Nin's fate involved other officers as well. The precise chain of command for this specific operation is not fully established in the historical record. What is clear is that Orlov was the senior Soviet intelligence official in Spain during this period, and that operations of this kind were conducted within his area of authority. Perhaps the most operationally significant act of Orlov's time in Spain was his management of the transfer of Spanish gold reserves to the Soviet Union. In October 1936, with Franco's forces advancing on Madrid and the Republican government fearing the capital might fall, Soviet representatives persuaded the Republican leadership to transfer the gold reserves of the Bank of Spain to the Soviet Union for safekeeping. The operation, which Orlov helped to organize and supervise, involved the shipment of approximately 510 metric tons of gold, representing roughly 3/4 of Spain's gold reserves, to Odessa. The gold never returned to Spain. After the Republic's defeat in 1939, the Soviet Union retained the gold, eventually applying it against the cost of Soviet military assistance to the Republic. The full accounting of this transaction and what happened to the gold has remained a subject of historical dispute. Orlov's involvement in organizing the shipment placed him at the center of an operation that the Spanish government would later regard as a significant grievance. While Orlov was conducting these operations in Spain, the world he'd come from was being destroyed. The Great Purge in the Soviet Union was consuming the NKVD itself with particular ferocity. Yezhov, having replaced Yagoda as head of the NKVD, was conducting a systematic purge of the entire security apparatus, arresting thousands of intelligence officers on charges of espionage, Trotskyism, and participation in anti-Soviet conspiracies. The logic of the purge was self-expanding. Each arrested officer was tortured into naming colleagues and subordinates, creating ever wider circles of accusation that swept through the entire professional intelligence community. For senior NKVD officers stationed abroad, the purge was experienced as a series of disappearances. Colleagues who returned to Moscow on routine assignments or who were recalled for meetings stopped communicating. Letters went unanswered. Names vanished from organizational rosters. The understanding of what was happening filtered through in fragments, in careful conversations with other officers who were trying to read the same signals, to understand what was happening to the institution they'd spent their careers building. Orlov watched this process with the analytical attention of a professional intelligence officer and the personal terror of a man who understood he was potentially its next subject. He had worked with many of the men being arrested. He knew their professional histories, their political connections, their relationships within the apparatus. He could trace the logic of how accusations spread, how one man's forced confession produced the names of others, how the circle expanded outward until it could in principle consume anyone. He also had specific reasons for personal concern. His cousin was Zinovy Katznelson, a senior NKVD official who was arrested in 1937 and subsequently shot. This family connection to an arrested enemy of the people was exactly the kind of contamination that could trigger an investigation of Orlov himself. In the logic of the purge, association with an enemy, even a family connection, was grounds for suspicion. Orlov knew this. He had operated in a system where such logic was applied daily. The accumulation of these signals, colleagues disappearing, his cousin arrested and shot, the increasingly frantic and unpredictable nature of Moscow's communications with its officers abroad, all of it was building toward a moment of decision that Orlov must have known was approaching. The question was not whether his recall would come, but when, and whether he would be able to read the signal accurately when it arrived. When the telegram came in July 1938, ordering him to the Soviet ship in Antwerp, Orlov made his decision in terms of timing with remarkable speed. He had perhaps days, possibly less, before his failure to comply would trigger an active hunt for him. He used those days carefully. Before leaving Spain, Orlov took a step that was either an act of extraordinary calculation or extraordinary courage, possibly both. He wrote a letter to Stalin. The letter, which Orlov later described in his memoirs, informed Stalin that he was aware he had been called to his death, that he had made arrangements for information about sensitive Soviet intelligence operations to be released if he or his family were harmed, and that he was prepared to maintain silence about Soviet secrets as long as he and his family were left alone. This was an audacious gambit. Orlov was, in effect, telling the most dangerous man in the world that he was defecting and threatening consequences if Stalin retaliated. It was a form of deterrence applied to personal survival that drew on Orlov's intimate knowledge of how Stalin thought and what Stalin feared. The threat of exposure, of sensitive intelligence operations being burned, of agent networks being compromised was real, and Stalin understood it as real. The gambit worked, at least in the short term. Stalin, rather than dispatching assassination teams after Orlov, allowed him and his family to disappear into the West without immediate active pursuit. This was completely atypical. Soviet defectors were normally hunted relentlessly, regardless of what information they threatened to expose. The fact that Orlov was left largely alone for years suggests the deterrence threat was effective, that he possessed information sensitive enough that exposing it was a cost Stalin preferred not to incur. Orlov and his family settled in the United States, first living quietly under assumed identities, moving periodically to avoid detection, maintaining the extreme caution of people who understood exactly how the organization hunting them operated. He didn't seek out American intelligence immediately. He didn't offer his knowledge to the FBI or CIA in exchange for protection. He lived for years in a strange liminal state, a former Soviet intelligence chief hiding in plain sight in America, known to Stalin, unknown to American authorities. His daughter Vera died in 1940 from a heart condition that had been diagnosed years earlier. The loss devastated him and his wife Maria. In a life defined by concealment and professional compartmentalization, this personal grief was something that couldn't be managed or controlled through operational discipline. The period between his defection in 1938 and his eventual public emergence in the early 1950s is one of the most peculiar in the history of Cold War intelligence. Orlov was in America, possessing knowledge of extraordinary sensitivity, including what he knew about Soviet penetration of Western intelligence services, about agent networks that were still active, about the methods and organizational structure of Soviet intelligence. None of this was being shared with American authorities. Why did Orlov not approach the FBI or American intelligence for years? The answer involves multiple factors. The deterrence arrangement he'd established with Stalin depended on mutual non-aggression. Orlov stayed quiet. The Soviets didn't send assassins. Approaching American intelligence would have changed the equation, potentially provoking Soviet retaliation. It would also have required him to betray agents and operations, some of which involved people who were not his enemies, people he'd recruited or worked with, who had their own reasons for their choices, and whose exposure would destroy them. There was also the question of what American intelligence would do with the information about Cambridge. Orlov knew, from his period of work in Britain, about Soviet penetration at high levels of British and possibly American intelligence. That knowledge was dangerous in multiple directions. Exposing it would burn agent networks and destroy careers, but sitting on it while those agents continued to operate was its own kind of complicity in the damage they were doing. Stalin's death in March 1953 changed Orlov's calculation. The deterrence arrangement had been personal, directed at Stalin, and its terms were partly dependent on Stalin's specific fear of exposure. With Stalin gone, the political landscape had changed sufficiently that Orlov decided to make himself known to American authorities. He appeared before the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee and gave testimony about Soviet intelligence operations and methods. His testimony was significant and carefully managed. He revealed genuine information about Soviet intelligence methods, organizational structures, and general operational patterns. He described his own career and activities in detail that was historically valuable and intelligence operationally informative. He confirmed information that Western intelligence had obtained through other means, adding context and analytical depth. But he did not reveal everything he knew. Most significantly, he did not, in his public testimony or in his dealings with American intelligence, reveal what he knew about the Cambridge Five. Philby, Burgess, McLean, Blunt, and Cairncross continued their careers, some of them continuing to pass intelligence to the Soviet Union for years after Orlov came in from the cold. Whether Orlov's silence on this specific subject was part of a residual ethical commitment to people he'd recruited, or whether it was a continuing form of insurance, or whether his knowledge of the Cambridge network was less specific than has sometimes been suggested, remains one of the most debated questions in intelligence history. Philby himself, who eventually defected to the Soviet Union in 1963 after being exposed, wrote in his memoirs that he'd known about Orlov's defection for years and had lived with the constant concern that Orlov would betray him. The fact that Orlov didn't, or at least didn't do so publicly and explicitly, is something that Philby acknowledged without fully explaining, because Philby himself didn't fully understand Orlov's reasoning. After his congressional testimony, Orlov published his memoirs and became something of a public figure in the world of Cold War intelligence commentary. His 1953 book, The Secret History of Stalin's Crimes, drew on his direct knowledge of the Stalin period to provide an account of Soviet methods and Soviet crimes that was valuable as historical documentation. His later book on Soviet intelligence methods was treated by Western intelligence professionals as a genuinely useful operational guide, written with the authority of someone who had actually run major operations. He taught at the University of Michigan for a period, living the strange life of a former Soviet intelligence chief turned academic, the man who knew where multiple bodies were buried, metaphorically and sometimes literally, now lecturing American students about international relations and Soviet affairs. He maintained contact with American intelligence over the years, though the full extent of what he shared in private versus what he said publicly has never been fully established. The question of how much Orlov actually told American intelligence and how much he continued to withhold is one that intelligence historians have been examining for decades, particularly after documents from Soviet and American archives became more accessible following the Cold War. The picture that emerges is of a man who cooperated selectively, who revealed enough to establish credibility and to satisfy the most pressing American counterintelligence needs, while protecting specific secrets whose exposure would have had consequences he was unwilling to accept. His own assessment of what he'd done with his career, the operations he'd run, the people he'd recruited, the decisions he'd made in Spain, is not fully accessible from the historical record. His public writings were those of a man who had made peace with his past, or at least presented himself as having done so, framing his intelligence career as service to a cause he'd believed in before understanding its true nature, and his defection as a moral act, a rejection of a system he'd recognized as irredeemably criminal. Whether that framing was honest or self-serving, whether it captured the full complexity of who Alexander Orlov was and what he'd done, is a question the historical record can't definitively answer. What it can establish is the arc of a life that moved from revolutionary commitment to professional service, to personal terror, to flight to reluctant cooperation with former enemies, a trajectory that captures something essential about what it meant to be a senior figure in Stalin's intelligence apparatus. Orlov died in Cleveland, Ohio, on March 25, 1973, at the age of 77. He had outlived Stalin by 20 years, had outlived the deterrence arrangement that had protected him, had outlived the Soviet state as it existed when he fled it, had lived long enough to see the Cold War reach its most dangerous moments and begin, cautiously, to stabilize. He died in America, a country that was never quite his home, having spent 35 years living in the shadow of what he knew and what he'd done. His wife Maria survived him. She had shared his defection, his years of hiding, his emergence into American public life, the loss of their daughter, all the decades of a life lived in the strange, suspended state of the defector, belonging fully to neither the world left behind nor the world arrived in. The Soviet state that Orlov had served erased him from its official histories in the standard way. His name disappeared from organizational records. His contributions to Soviet intelligence operations were unacknowledged. The agent networks he'd built, the operations he'd run, the institutional knowledge he'd contributed to the development of Soviet intelligence, all of it was attributed elsewhere or simply unmentioned. He became another non-person, another figure whose existence was inconvenient to the official narrative and whose erasure was therefore required. But the erasure didn't take, not completely, not in the way that the Soviet system preferred. Because Orlov had gotten out, had taken his knowledge with him, had published it in books and delivered it in testimony, had placed it in the historical record in ways that couldn't simply be painted over or cropped from photographs. The man the Soviet system tried to erase left behind more of himself than almost any of the others it consumed, precisely because he'd escaped before it could finish its work. His story sits at the intersection of several of the 20th century's defining narratives. The ideological appeal of Soviet communism to talented people who believed in its promises. The construction of a global intelligence apparatus that shaped Cold War politics for decades. The Great Terror that consumed the institution Orlov had helped to build. And the long reckoning of defectors and survivors trying to make sense of what they'd been part of and what they'd done. There's no clean moral resolution to Alexander Orlov's life. He served a murderous system with genuine professional dedication for 2 decades. He helped build methods of political repression that were used against thousands of people. He ran operations that killed individuals whose only crime was holding the wrong political opinions or being in the wrong factional position at the wrong time. He knew about and possibly contributed to the development of agent networks that caused significant damage to Western security. He also, at a moment of genuine personal danger, made a choice to leave rather than continue, took a risk that could easily have gotten him killed, protected his family, and eventually contributed to the historical understanding of the system he'd served. He held certain secrets longer than he should have, protected people who continued to cause harm, and shaped his public testimony in ways that served his own interests as well as the interests of truth. He was, in other words, a complicated human being who had operated in an environment that demanded moral simplification, that required you to stop asking certain questions and start performing certain functions, and who eventually reached the point where the questions could no longer be suppressed. The Soviet spy who helped Stalin rise did not help Stalin forever. He ran, and he lived, and he talked, and he wrote, and the system that tried to erase him found that some things, once known, cannot be made unknown, that some histories, once started, cannot be simply ended by a bureaucratic decision to remove a name from a record. That's the thing about the intelligence business that all the great spy stories eventually come back to. Information, once it exists, has a life of its own. Alexander Orlov knew things. He carried them across an ocean, protected them for years, released them selectively over decades, and died with some still unrevealed, if the historians are right about what he withheld. The man Stalin tried to erase left a longer shadow than Stalin intended. In the business of secrets, that's about as close to victory as anyone ever gets.